Hey everybody, it's Dan, and welcome back to We War Game. For those longtime viewers, you may recognize that I finally have a title card. Got some music going in the background, so I think 2025 is shaping up to be a great year already. And speaking of which, what we have here is our first hobby project of the year, which is a unit of 30 Victrix Huscarls, or Anglo-Danish Huscarls, if we're being specific, that I actually started about 4 months ago. I think back when I put a poll out and you guys voted that this should be the next unit I should paint. And I got as far as the chainmail and the skin on these guys and then kind of ran out of steam. And I'm pretty adamant about that if I kind of lose interest in a project, I'll set it aside and come back to it later when I have some motivation, because I think first and foremost, this hobby should be fun, right? If it starts feeling like work, kind of what's the point? So that's what happened here. I put it aside and then got my mojo back and decided to start painting them again. What I'm doing here actually is coming in with Corax White to clean up some areas that I hit with chainmail and skin, because as I've now done, I think in the last 2 videos, with this Razzle Dazzle painting style I do, which involves blocking out colors, a very light, bright dry brush, and then a wash. However, with the blocking out step for the last couple of projects, I've actually been kind of like inking. I've been watering my paints down to sort of contrast paint consistency and then applying that over a white undercoat, which creates a nice gradient of color, because again, we're working our way up to a pure white highlight, and to use watered down, thinned down paint leaves kind of a pigmented color behind. You'll see when we do the wash step. But in doing that, some people had recommended in the last video that I try this Vallejo thinning medium instead of just watering the paint down, because I'm watering it down pretty heavily. It's like 1-to-1 ratio of then water and paint, now this thinning medium and paint. And I think all this is acrylic paint without any pigment in it, but whatever the case is, I love this stuff. It goes on so smooth, and again, going back to gradient of color that it leaves behind is just much more gradual than with pure water. So again, big thanks to those that recommended I try this out, because it really is a fantastic product. So what I did there is I did the wood grain colors back of the shield and the axe shaft in Xandri dust. That's kind of my go-to wood grain color. And then I actually lost a bunch of footage, so I ended up coming back with these 2 figures and bringing them back up to the same state that we were at in the last shot, and then we'll continue on with just these 2 figures for the rest of this video until the end when I show you the finished unit. I also discovered, speaking of kind of quality of life improvements from my videos, I figured out how to zoom in my editing software, so hopefully you'll find that a little bit more useful as well throughout the course of this video. So now I'm moving on to tunics, and I've mentioned before that with Dark Age figures especially, but ancients as well, I tend to go with lots of browns and beige colors for any kind of clothing that they're wearing, and that's what's happening here. So with 2 figures, I'm choosing 2 different brown colors. In this case, this is Tuskor fur from Citadel, also watered down or thinned down in a 1-to-1 or roughly 1-to-1 ratio. And then applying it on the pants of the first figure, and then it'd be the tunic of the second figure. And then I'll flip-flop for the second color. So I think it's Rakarth Flesh, which is like a grayish tan color that I'll do for the unpainted tunic on the first figure, and then the pants on the second figure. So it's a nice way of doing things. Even with 2 figures, you can kind of assembly line, mix things up how you like. Again, I usually use browns and beiges, tans, and I save the bright colors for shields. However, I might use like a dark green or something here and there, or a very dark red, but I tend to stay away from bright colors on clothing. But you can see, or maybe it's difficult to see, but I've noticed anyway, that it really does behave like contrast paint when you use this thinning medium. And it goes down into the recesses as you would expect, and then leaves kind of brighter areas behind in the raised areas. You can really see it on the pants there on that one figure that I'm turning in my hand. And it actually makes me believe that that's kind of all contrast paint is really highly pigmented paint with thinning medium, maybe some flow enhancer. Whatever the case is, I really am enjoying this. And you can see it's already creating highlights right where I would want them to be before I've even gone in with my dry brush step, which is fantastic. And it has the added benefit, unlike contrast paint, that it does not create lowlights. It's mostly focusing on highlights, because contrast paint, I've found the problem with it is that because there's a heavy wash at the end of this painting style, it creates areas that are too dark in the recesses of some of the models. So this addresses that problem by really not creating much in the way of lowlights. It's really just focusing on highlights. So I painted the cowl in Steel Legion Drab as the cowl, and then like the hauberk underneath that chainmail, I used Steel Legion Drab, also watered down. Here I'm coming in with Scrag Brown, undiluted, other than the fact that all of my paints in the pot are slightly diluted. But I didn't use any thinning medium here because I didn't think I'd have enough brush control to paint like a mustache at this scale. So this is mostly just out of the pot, Scrag Brown for the beard and mustache on both of these figures. I mentioned before, these are Victrix Anglo-Danish Huscarls, which I think was like the third box that they put out after their Vikings, which I've said before are, I think, really mark a turning point in terms of Victrix from a quality standpoint. But I'd forgotten just how much I really love these figures, that they're not quite as heavily armored as, say, like their new Rus, or certainly not their armored Saxons, which have a lot of like chainmail masks, sculpted greaves, sculpted cuirasses, even in some cases. However, these, they really have a lot of mass to them still, I think, because so many of them have that cowl and in a lot of cases have like padded armor underneath their chainmail. And you can see here, like, the belts, all of them have like sculpted belts, extra belts going over their shoulders where the shield would be strapped on some pouches, and a lot of them have that really large, kind of scary looking sax knife on their belt. So I really do find these figures to be imposing and appropriate for like elite infantry, despite the fact that they're not technically as armored as some of their newer kits that they've put out. And these are mostly straight out of the box too. I did a couple of head swaps, but otherwise these are pretty much just straight out of the kit. What I'm painting here are belts and sword scabbards, shoes, and as with tunics, I tend to use at least 2, sometimes even 3 or 4 different colors for leather. And in this case, it's Rhinox hide is that darker brown. This reddish brown is Doombull brown, and I find that contrast to be very nice. So as with the tunics, I did the same thing here, which is I painted the belts one color on figure A, and the shoes that same color on figure B, and then I flip-flop. I painted the shoes on this figure, which has the Rhinox hide belt. He got Doombull brown shoes, and then this one, which has Doombull brown belts, has Rhinox hide shoes. You can also see, again, I keep going back to that gradient of color, kind of like the lighter areas toward the tops. It also works very well on these belts, I found, again, even before a dry brush step is being used. Here we have some golds. I tend to use historical figures in fantasy war games, so I am a little bit heavy-handed in terms of where and when I use gold accents, just because I think it's such a fantastic contrasting color, and it seems to work for fantasy games. But interestingly, despite these being like elite heavy infantry, I didn't find that there were a lot of places I wanted to use gold on. So there you go. So I've got the figures base coated up to where the other ones were. I just want to do the shields now. And I decided early on that I wanted to go with a simple motif for all of these shields, because I'm going to be doing, for my Rus and my Varangians, a much more complex shield design. So I thought I would just, for tutorial's sake, just stick to either a solid color, halved colors, like each side of the shield being one half of a contrasting color, or quartered. So those are the like 3 different styles. Maybe a couple had very simple little like circular designs on them or something like that, but I stayed away from anything complicated for these guys. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm using, once again, undiluted paints, semi-diluted in the pot. This is Mephiston Red, which it really is my favorite Citadel color, maybe my favorite color overall, but it's certainly my favorite Citadel color because it has such excellent coverage. It's a nice vibrant color. So the first one I'm having, and you can see I'm starting to quarter on this shield, which, as with any kind of freehand work, which I still consider this, despite the fact that we're doing kind of simple designs here, it really does involve just going into it knowing you're going to have to come back multiple times. So you're not going to get the lines perfectly straight on the first pass, or if you do, it's just a happy coincidence. But you kind of have to go into it knowing that you're going to have to straighten it up with multiple passes of each color, which is good anyway, because you should be doing 2 thin coats of each color to begin with. That's just better from a painting standpoint. So if you use each of those opportunities to sort of straighten up the line a little bit more, you're going to end up with a much better end result. Because even here, I can see, looking at this footage, that those lines aren't perfectly straight, but that's fine, because I'm going to come in with the black now, in this particular case, to cut in against the red. And then I'm going to come back after the black dries to do a second coat of the red and use that opportunity to neaten up the lines to make them as even as I possibly can. And don't worry too about making them like perfect 25% of a pie, kind of, especially if you're doing this quartering like I'm doing, because if you look at, you know, it's mostly speculation to begin with anyway, but if you look at pictures of like example Viking shields, you'll find that not all of them are, you know, perfect 25% quartered designs. Some of them are like thinner fanning out. Anyway, just that's really what I did here is I went in and looked at just some example shields and came up with a couple of different designs and color variations that I liked. For the most part too, I was using kind of any colors that I want as long as they were contrasting. Here I'm using that Rakarth flesh color again. The only ones I stay away from in this period are like purples, pinks, oranges, things that you wouldn't really expect to be on a shield. But otherwise, yeah, I'm using more vibrant colors certainly than I would use on tunics, just being sure if I'm doing two halves of a shield that they're slightly contrasted colors, whatever two that I choose. And yeah, as I said, multiple passes. And then, yeah, now these two figures are brought up to the same level as all 30 figures that are in this unit. And so what we're going to do before this dry brush step is we're going to come in and weather the shields a little bit. So to do that, I'm using Rhinox hide. Ideally, if you had sort of that spongy material that comes in a blister pack, that's probably the best stuff to use for this, but I didn't have any handy, so in a pinch, an old brush works. And you're going to load it like you would for dry brushing. But instead, what you're then going to do with these big round shields is you're going to stipple on, this again is Rhinox, has a nice dark brown color, and doing it in kind of random patterns, spinning the brush as you go, just so that the same like bristle pattern doesn't show up in multiple places. And you can see I'm not being super heavy-handed with it. I'm even going over black areas, dark areas, because it does show up a little bit. And it just creates the illusion of kind of like scuffs, stings, and dents, things of that nature. And then to enhance that a little bit more, I'm now coming with Nuln oil from Citadel, and with a liner brush, creating kind of like sword strokes. They're lines instead of scuffs, and the color is slightly different from the brown. It's more transparent, so it creates a slightly different effect. And then on a handful of these models, I'm coming in with Xandri Dust, which is again the back of the shield color, to create the effect of like a hit that's so hard that it broke through the paint and is showing the underlying wood color. And I'm actually low lighting on these. This is like an old Space Marine weathering trick where you can, if you do a dot of a highlight color on the bottom of a piece of damage, it looks like a chip. So that's pretty cool. My wife got me these makeup brushes, I think is what they are, for dry brushing work. And I love these. This is fantastic. This is probably some of the finest dry brush work I think I've ever done. So I highly, highly recommend this. I think these are pretty cheap makeup brushes. You can pick them up anywhere. So I'll be using these exclusively moving forward for my dry brushing work. And what I'm doing here, this is just pure white. If you've never seen any of my tutorial videos before, we're going over that base coat color. A very, very light dry brush, like the lightest dry brush you've ever done. And you can always come back and kind of build the color up if you like, but you're really just trying to create the impression of a highlight here where there isn't one, or maybe is a weak one. You're just gonna try to enhance that a little bit. Staying away from flat areas. You can see I'm not doing anything with the shield there just because it will create streaks. It doesn't look right. But I'm really focusing on areas like the hands, the tunic, like folds in the tunic, that is. Hair also seems to pick this up very nicely, but staying away also from the chainmail. We're going to do a separate highlight with bright silver on the chainmail areas. So then if you like, I come in with a detail brush with that same white color, and I'm going to pick out, I call them dot highlights. They're very, very small highlights. And you can see I'm focusing on like the knuckles. I'm using the prior dry brush step kind of as a guide, where if there are any areas where there's an especially bright dry brush highlight, I might enhance that a little bit with just a little tiny dot of pure white. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing with silver, slightly more heavy-handed, just because silver, it's a little bit harder to pick out, but you can see I'm doing some highlights on the rim of the shield there, out of the top of the helmet, kind of on the sleeves of the chainmail. There's a couple areas to pick out. So I found that there was sort of a pattern to it on all these figures, which made it nice and easy. So that's what I'm doing here, just doing these highlights, and it looks silly at this stage, but I promise once you wash it, it's going to look pretty cool. And then here is kind of the secret sauce to the Razzle Dazzle style, which is, it says Seraphim Sepia, but it's actually more Agrax Cerussate. It's a mix of a bunch of different washes. And this whole technique kind of stemmed out of dipping models with Army Painter Quick Shade, but I found by just using a heavy-handed wash, it created much the same effect with, it looks slightly different from dipping, but I find that the trade-off is well worth it given how, in my opinion, like kind of labor-intensive dipping models is. So yeah, you're gonna do just a super, super heavy wash over the entire model. Doesn't matter if it's like over a black surface, it truly does not matter. Everything is gonna get a nice heavy wash. And then what you're gonna do is take a dryer brush, and you can see I'm kind of dabbing it onto a paper towel there, and you're gonna wick away any paint where you don't want it to be, or any wash where you don't want it to be. And it's gonna want to pool, I found, like on the back where it connects with the shield, on the feet there, on the like the axe head. So you're just gonna wick that away. And then here it is dried overnight. I don't play around, I let it dry for 24 hours before I start doing anything again, just to make sure the wash completely dries. And yeah, I think the effect's pretty cool. Like, it really does create the illusion of highlights, like layered highlights. So then I do recommend you get yourself a anti-shine matte varnish. I use Army Painter. I highly, highly recommend that if you don't have any yourself. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm putting it over everything except for the silver areas, because you can imagine if you put a matte varnish over metallics, that it will dull that shine. And then yeah, I've got tutorial videos on this. I threw a paper banner on. I'm gonna come through and do some blood effects. Again, I have tutorials on both of those things. I'll put links in the descriptions. I paint the eyes, and then the unit's done, after the basing, of course. But I'm really pleased with how this unit turned out. I think it was a lot of fun coming back again. That's my main takeaway, is if you're not having fun with something, put it aside. And then somehow, magically, 4 months later, it was a lot of fun again. So, really pleased with this, and I appreciate you guys dropping by for this one. And until next time, happy gaming.